Good evening. My name is Arnold Franklin, and on behalf of Small Emuni US, I'm delighted to welcome everyone to tonight's event, an author talk with Adi Mahalel on his new translation of Hanan Ayalti's novel Boom und Ketten, or in its English translation, Boom and Chains, a Yiddish novel set in Israel-Palestine. We also have with us tonight Jonathan Boyarin as our discussant. I should say this is in many ways the Platonic ideal of a Small Emuni event. The topic could hardly be more timely, but it's especially fitting because Adi was one of the group's original founders, long before Small Emuni even had a name. Before I formally introduce our speakers, though, permit me to share a few words of Torah, as is our custom. This week's parasha concludes the story of Pinchas that began in yesterday's reading. To recap, in a moment of communal crisis, a plague that was ravaging the Israelites' encampment, Pinchas commits an act of religious zealotry, killing an Israelite man and a Midianite woman engaged in an illicit union. When the Torah immediately tells us, Vateatzara magefat, the plague stopped, it appears to suggest divine approval for his actions. This impression is reinforced at the opening of this week's parasha when God declares of Pinchas that because of his zeal, Hineni noten lo et briti shalom, I grant him my covenant of peace. The juxtaposition of shalom with an act of violence is deeply unsettling, and commentators throughout the generations have struggled with the resulting image of Pinchas. I'd like to place this episode alongside another moment in our parasha, 2 chapters later. After God tells Moshe that he will not enter the promised land with Bnei Israel, Moshe turns not to his own fate, but to the question of leadership, asking God, Yifkod Hashem Elokei haruchot lechol basar ish al ha'ida. Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint someone over the community. Rashi is intrigued by Moshe's unusually elaborate description of God as Elokei haruchot lechol basar, and paraphrases his intended meaning as follows. Ribono shel olam, galoi lefanecha da'ato shel kol echad ve'echad, ve'enan domin ze lazeh. Maneh alehem manhig sheyeh sovel kol echad ve'echad lefi da'ato. Lord of the universe, the mind of each and every person is revealed before you, and no two are alike. Appoint over them a leader who will bear with each individual according to that person's disposition. Two things strike me about this episode. The first is that it offers a striking counterpoint to the model of leadership represented by Pinchas at the beginning of the parasha. Rather than valorizing zealotry, Moshe imagines leadership as the capacity to live with difference, to recognize that people are fundamentally unlike one another, and to lead them accordingly. The second is that this vision originates not in a divine command, but in a human appeal. God has already given his blessing to Pinchas. Yet, when the conversation turns to the future leadership of the people, Moshe does not simply assume that this is the model to be emulated. Instead, he asks God for something different. And in doing so, Moshe models a remarkable kind of religious courage, the willingness not only to listen to the word of God, but also to challenge it, to press for a more capacious and humane vision of what leadership, and perhaps even what covenant itself, ought to look like. We live in a moment when zealotry in the name of holy purposes is on the rise. May we have the wisdom of Moshe to discern the need for governments that recognize the inherent dignity of all human beings, and may we also have the courage to stand up and demand them. And now to our main event. We have with us this evening Dr. Adi Mahalel, who teaches Yiddish studies at Harvard. He is the author of The Radical Isaac, Peretz and the Rise of Jewish Socialism, SUNY 2023, and the translation and scholarly introduction of Hanan Ayalti's Boom and Chains, a Yiddish novel set in Israel-Palestine, which is the occasion for tonight's event. Dr. Mahalel has published articles and translations in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English, and has taught at Columbia, the University of Maryland, McGill University, and the YIVO Institute. We also have with us this evening Dr. Jonathan Boyarin, the Mann Professor of Modern Jewish Studies at Cornell University. Dr. Boyarin is a veteran ethnographer of Ashkenazi Jewish communities and a translator of works about that world. His most recent book, edited and translated together with Jonah Samson Boyarin, is As the Story Goes, Funny, Strange, and Serious Stories of Yiddish Land's Jews. Adi, Jonathan, please join us.
Thank you, Arnold, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming, and everybody on Zoom. It's really an honor. As Arnold said, I've been involved with Small Emuni US from the early stages before I was even Small Emuni, so it's really heartwarming that this event comes together. I've been able to show in this forum my project. I'm very honored to share it with you. So I want to have this presentation and then we'll move to the moderation with Dr. Boyarin. So I called my presentation Ayalti's Boom and Chains and Why Yiddish Matters in Figuring Out Israel-Palestine. So I'll start. At a time when there seems to be no common language or vocabulary for justice and peace in Israel-Palestine, Yiddish might offer meaningful insights. Surprised? It's no surprise that those versed in modern Jewish political culture, like most of you here, or many of you, since the 1800s, various factions of diaspora nationalists, Jewish socialists, and ultra-Orthodox Jews, among others, chose to champion the Yiddish language as an expression of commitment to both working class and traditional Jewish way of life, in contrast to Hebrew, the language associated with the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and later Zionist movements. Thus, roughly up until World War II, while Yiddish was identified with labor movements as much as with Hasidic Jews, Hebrew was considered to be identified with groups aligned with, let's say, the middle classes. In Paris, during the mid-1930s, just before becoming Hannah Arendt's Hebrew tutor and lifelong friend, a young Polish-born author named Hanan, better known by the pen name Ayalti, sat down to write a novel based on the 4 tumultuous years he had just spent in Mandatory Palestine. And he made a pivotal decision. He chose to write in Yiddish. He had written his first novel in Hebrew, this novel right here called Bamchilot, a language born in the Middle East, even though that novel was set in Europe. And now for his second novel, Boom and Chains, he switched to Yiddish, the language that defined European Ashkenazi Jewry for a millennium, even though the novel was set in the land of Israel, Palestine. So how does one reconcile this apparent contradiction between geography and language, and how does this contrast relate to labor politics, for example, things that interest me? The answer lays in contradictory orientations. While the location of his first Hebrew novel was Europe, the aspiration of its protagonists was outward and forward, to move to the land of Israel and live the communal agrarian way of life in a kibbutz, essentially to realize the labor Zionist ideal of the model society. And that's the very last words of the Hebrew novel, his debut novel, in which he writes, Gam po tov achrei amal yom aroch. Also here it's good after a hard work's day. But the true goodness is actually over there. On the other land and under the other sky, meaning in the land of Israel. So that was the orientation at the end of the Hebrew novel, even though it was set in Europe. These kibbutz members were, in their own words, Zionist communists. Recognized by the likes of Noam Chomsky as realizing the anarcho-communist ideals of self-management and direct worker control of the means of production. In Ayalti's Yiddish novel Boom and Chains, based on the author's experiences in Palestine from 1921 to 1933, the protagonists were again looking outward, but this time in reverse. Set entirely in Palestine, Israel, hefty portions of which in a kibbutz, its main characters sought to leave the kibbutz or leave the land entirely. This relocation meant a rejection, an abandonment of the labor Zionist model, as Ayalti and his fellow rebels gradually came to realize excluded the local Arab peasant population, the Falahin. And I don't know if many of you saw the Palestinian movie that was nominated for the Oscar just now, Palestine 36, that depicts the beginning, the onset of the Great Arab Revolt from 36 to that lasted till 39. Well, at first when I saw it, it immediately threw me to Ayalti and Boom and Chains because it came out in 1936 and it was depicting similar things. Even in an interview that Ayalti gave to a Yiddish paper while the novel came out, he was asked specifically, "Sie hat geschrieben wegen die letzte Geschehnissen in Palestine." Have you written about the recent events in Palestine? And Ayalti answered, "Ich habe geendigt das Buch mit mehreren Monaten zurück." I already finished the novel months ago. Aber ich erlaube sich zu sagen, I permit myself to say, as analysieren die Lage in Palästina, as analyzing the situation in Palestine, habe ich die Geschehnissen vorausgesehen. I predicted these events. Ich habe euch ähnliche Geschehnissen beschrieben. I also portrayed similar events in the novel, which is very, very true. We have a Q&A. Sildik? Yes, I will get, you're right. It was serialized, and I'll get to it actually a little bit right, that it was serialized in the Yiddish press, thank you for that question, as Träumen und Ketten, Dreams and Chains, and then in a book form, and he'll change to Boom and Chains, and I'll get to that change. I'll be very happy to talk about that change. Okay, so disillusioned with the kibbutz, these rebels, like Ayalti, left the kibbutz and joined the first Arab Jewish party in Palestine, the PKP. The name is a Yiddish acronym for Palästinische Kommunistische Partei, the Palestine Communist Party, which went out specifically against labor Zionist practices of the time, like the conquest of labor. This particular pamphlet specifically addresses in Hebrew in this time the labor Zionist youth and propagates they should reject kibush avodah chuligani, the kind of hooligan conquest of labor, the barbaric conquest of labor. It goes against sharply socialist ideals. The young Yiddish-speaking labor Zionists had originally envisioned themselves, originally meaning in Europe, envisioned themselves joining the Falahin, the Arab farmers, in the struggle against the rich Arab landowners, the FND, and the British rulers. In practice, on the ground, rather than joining forces with the Falahin, these young idealists realized that they were displacing them. And symbolically, by joining the PKP, Ayalti and his fellow renegades changed their allegiance from the Hebrew name Hashomer Atzair, the young God, the socialist Zionist group on the far left of the Zionist movement. It was, for example, the only Zionist party to recognize the national rights of Palestinian Arabs, and up to 1948 hold a binational vision for the land. And then they accepted the petition, the Ben-Gurion petition. And Ayalti was part of a Shomer Hatzair already in Poland, in Bialystok. So he came with that movement to form a kibbutz with the same group. And this is Ayalti, and this is his kibbutz, Binyamina, in 1930 on May Day. I have some suspicion, but I might be wrong, that this is Ayalti himself holding the red flag on May Day. So, as I said, and the Shomer Hatzair included in its ranks the likes of Noam Chomsky that I mentioned, and my family members. And they switched from a Shomer Hatzair to the Yiddish named Arab Jewish party, the PKP, the Palästinische Kommunistische Partei. Ayalti clarified his novel's unusual unusual Yiddish title, Boom und Ketten, Boom and Chains, in the epigraph. So that's part of the question about changing the title. He clarified it, and when he writes the Boom and Ketten, boom is not an unusual, it's an uncommon word in Yiddish, but he chose to use it. And in the epigraph, he writes, Eretz Yisrael in boom, the land of Israel in boom is booming. At the same time, Palestine in Katen, Palestine in chains. That's the meaning of boom and Katen, of boom and chains, a very obviously explosive title. And that's the novel he wrote. And somebody suggested, how come they uses the boom, uncommon use in Yiddish? Somebody suggested to me that it has to do with the fact that it was about mandatory Palestine, and it was a word used, can be used in English, the word boom, booming, and the likes. Growth is, yes, is the boom is about explosions or economic boom and the likes. It's more of the economic boom and the success. That's the contrast here that lays in the title. Eretz Yisrael in boom, the land of Israel is booming, Palestine in Katen, Palestine in chains. So as you can see, working on such a novel with such a title, with such material especially during the last few years, got me to reflect on certain issues to do with our world, naturally. For example, I couldn't help but ask myself whether, for example, the establishment of joint Jewish-Arab communal agrarian settlements 100 years ago, an idea I'm borrowing from a friend, in fact, could have changed the course. Excuse me. Second. Could it change? Could the establishment of joint Jewish Arab kibbutzim 100 years ago could have changed the course of history altogether and prevent the horrific present-day reality of bloodshed and war? Or would a joint Arab-Jewish kibbutz have been destined to forever remain an abstract fantasy as much as the socialist kibbutz itself, giving the increasingly privatized state of present-day kibbutzim? And this is even my attempt to create an AI version of the chalutzim and the falahin together didn't come out so harmoniously. Even the AI needed some more guidance. They don't look, they really kind of together. That's the falahin, that's the chalutzim. Together they still seem a bit apart, but some more AI guidance and maybe it can be. Now, and furthermore, how is all this somehow related to the political use of Yiddish by the new socialist mayor of New York, Zohar Mamdani, whose platform was characterized by the Satmar Hasidic paper he gave an interview to in 2025 as vorschlagend was Zielen zu verbessern das Leben von die Arbeiterklassen, proposals that aim to improve the lives of the working classes. And maybe some of those suggestions will be familiar to you, like umsiste public Bostransportatie. I don't know if that rings a bell. Or einfrieren Rent of rent-kontrollierte Dires. I don't know if you recognize that. Or umsiste childcare, or a minimum loan von $30 a show. That's pretty good. Or F&N public supermarkets was gehören zu der Stadt. I don't know if you're in favor of that. So that proves that its platform sounds better in Yiddish. And by the way, Hasidim I spoke to were very in favor of his class-centered policies. They're very much in favor of all these. They see how that can improve their everyday lives, and they were much in favor of it, and there's history there. Okay, so now through translating and researching this enormously relevant but forgotten Yiddish novel, I show how these rebellious Palestinian Israeli voices of the 1930s should remind us that history could have taken a different path. More importantly, I believe it could change its course today. And I always try to find a positive spin on things. So ultimately, it was the National Library of Israel, a Sifriya Leumit, which digitized the leftist Yiddish press that includes the serialization of this novel, a book that Ayalti himself termed a scharfer anti-Zionistische Roman, a sharp anti-Zionist novel. And it's because of the novel's critical stance that Ayalti didn't believe it could ever be published in Hebrew and decided to write it in Yiddish in the first place. As he said, was hab geschrieben, wollte man in Hebräisch nicht gedruckt. But I've written, they wouldn't have published in Hebrew in the first place. Now, shortly after the novel's publication, he traveled from Paris to Madrid to cover the civil war for a Parisian Yiddish communist paper. And he gave their talk in Yiddish as part of the Second International Congress of Anti-Fascist Writers in 1937. So alongside people like luminaries like Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell and the likes, Ayalti gave an anti-fascist speech in Yiddish, making Yiddish a relevant language in this anti-fascist cultural alliance. In later years, because of the novel's critical stance that Ayalti chose, given he revised his opinions once again, considering the dramatic events of the 1940s, to suppress Boom and Chains and omit it from his bibliography. But in the 2020s, this fascinating novel's New English form, its first ever translation to any language, demonstrate that there is a precedent for mutual empathy and solidarity between two long displaced peoples. Boom and Chain speaks of displacement in Yiddish, the very language of displacement spoken by 2/3 of Holocaust victims. Even in English translation, its perspective could play a part, I hope, in changing the current course trajectory and help us look forward towards the path of Yosher und Sholem, justice and peace. So thank you very much for that.
That was a masterful, concise presentation of very complex background. And now I have the privilege of digging into it a little bit further with you for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up. I want everybody to know, everybody who hasn't seen the book yet, to know, first of all, that Adi's introduction is a significant piece of scholarship in itself. I mean, that's not easy stuff to find out. And it's really solid documentation of who this person was and how he got there and who he became. And for me, you solved a mystery that was, I can't say was prominent in my mind, but I realized that I had been wondering about it probably since I was a teenager, because my parents had on their bookshelves a copy of Hanan Ayalti's Book of Yiddish Proverbs. And I was just sort of vaguely thought to myself, that's an odd name for somebody publishing books in Yiddish. And you explain in your introduction that he borrowed the name of the pioneering kibbutz Ayelet HaShachar for his last name and kept it afterwards, right? I also want to just give one bit of personal sort of oral history confirmation of one of the major themes that the book documents, which is the struggle on the ground, which in this case means in the fields and largely in the orange fields, for avodah ivrit, for establishing the right of Jewish workers to preserve their labor at a higher price than the local Arabs were quite willing to work for. When Alyssa and I were involved in Israel-Palestine work decades ago, we had an elder friend named Sam Newshots, and he remembered around the mid-30s, I don't remember exactly when, working in the orange fields, and somebody runs and say, there are Arabs working over there. And they went and chased them away. And this one of the scenes that Ayalti documents in his novel. Well, as you know, Adi, I'm a translator too, so I'm going to start with a translation question. What did you find most challenging about rendering this book into English, and how did you handle that?
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for this great question to start things off. Well, for me, one of the major challenges was because I'm not a native English speaker, so I had to make this smooth in English as possible. So that was one challenge for me. And meaning, take all this world in Mandatory Palestine with its unique vocabulary of both the labor Zionist vocabulary, both specifically Palestinian Arab vocabulary, which I'm reading in Yiddish transliteration. So that is a challenge to overcome. So I had terminology that even Arabic speakers couldn't help me with, again, because I had Yiddish transliteration. They not necessarily knew a little, it's a kind of obscure Palestinian Arabic vocabulary. I mean, one term, I remember one of the editors actually eventually helped me was mudafe, which is a unique Palestinian Arabic concept. There's many scenes in this mudafes where people host guests, and it's kind of at the front of a house. They're going to drink coffee, and it's like it's a custom, and it's something like a porch, if you think about it. Somewhat visited, but I had struggled with that for a long time until I found out what it is exactly. And there are other vocabulary that I knew because I grew up over there, obscure words that I heard as a kid, like zif zif, but I understood how that I has to, so I glossed those kind of words like mudaf and zif zif. I had to gloss as well because I don't think there's any English parallels to them.
Right. You do a great job in your introduction, in particular, of identifying some of the leading characters among the kibbutzim, right? Motke and Zalman and others as well. But I was wondering whether you had any sense of whether the main Fellahin characters or even the Palestinian activists were also based on individuals that Ayalti know, and are they traceable in any way?
Yes. So thank you, Jonathan, first of all, for the first part of your question. That is, I did have a lot of access to archives in Israel, labor Zionist archives. So I went to kibbutzim, I went to Zichron Yaakov, which is that area, and other places, Yad Yar, Shomer HaTzair archive. But and I was able to identify many of those individuals. It's true that I had less access to, if it's possible at all, and maybe it's part of the story, that there is now those archive Palestinian that I was able to, at least that I knew of, to be able to visit and try to identify these characters. I do give in an endnote, an introduction, there's one particular character called Rashid, who is a former Farachin, that I do add that I think it could be traced to, so I'm guessing, I'm getting an informed guess, it could be based on a guy named Mustafa Ali Ahmed from Safuria, who alongside two others was convicted of the murder of Yosef Yacobi and his son David in the settlement of Nahalal at the end of 1932. The three were executed the following year by the British, and the PKP, the Communist Party, issued a pamphlet in Yiddish about Ibn Yetztiken politischen Matzav, about the current political situation, and in which they protested that the government Gitarois italienische Urteilen gegen die Attentate of Jacobi, the issues death sentences against the murders of Jacobi, So this is one kind of identification that I can make, but you're right, I had less access to the Palestinian character. Yeah.
There's so much to say about that. No, I'm not going to now. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but it's, of course, but yeah. Mm.
Yes, a lot of
Well, but I was thinking more broadly about who retains a trace in archive and who becomes anonymous. Yeah.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, right. From a literary standpoint, for me, somehow the scenes on the beach at Haifa seem to me the most clearly realized. And what setting struck you as most vivid,
So
and why?
you mentioned those scenes in the beach in Haifa, and then you touched on a soft spot for me because Haifa is very dear to my heart. I feel very connected to that city. That's where I'm from. That's where my family traces back a long time. So there's a particular chapter that takes place in the city of Haifa. It's called Mustafa Learns About Women and Capitalism at the same time. It's a double lesson. And I actually loved this chapter so much that I translated it into Hebrew as well and gave a unique introduction for that one. And it's about these two Palestinian Arab workers at the limestone mill in Atlit, which the British used at the time to build the Haifa seaport, the Haifa port. So they go on their day off, they go to the big city of Haifa, and they kind of explore the nightlife there. And there's very fascinating contradictions between the Arab downtown and Haifa, which they go like a belly dancing club and other places and all kinds of other adventures. But then they move up to the newly kind of established neighborhood of Hadara Carmel, established by Ashkenazi kind of more middle class. And then they really kind of seeing it. It was Hadara Carmel was really created in the early 1920s, designed by a German Jewish architect named Richard Kaufmann, and so they both kind of experienced all this erotic wonders of the cinema and the cafes and the couples holding hands and the flashing lights and all that and all this kind of grandeur of this kind of and in that particular moment, like exposing themselves to this kind of bourgeois abundance, it's that time that they kind of become open to hearing the more critical social message of Zalman, the former kibbutznik turned PKP activist, and that's kind of that's one of my favorite chapters, without a doubt.
How can you keep them down on the farm after they've seen Haifa?
Exactly. Exactly. So between the milestone mill and it's all men and it's all hard work and it's terrible, and then going to Hadara Carmel and it's just delightful.
Yeah, and this isn't in my list of questions, but I'm just going to throw this in. But the novel Ayalti also documents the builders, right, and the class dimension, right, and a real tension between not just a political tension, but a social tension. What you kibbutzniks, it's like saying you're a bunch of hippies and you're never going to accomplish anything, and we're really building something here. Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Do you see any blind spots in the narrative that might be articulated with Ayalti's turn at this time, more or less toward the PKP and the Soviet-style communism? And anything that in your reading looks kind of distorted or a little bit tendentious?
To be honest,
I'm not sure I do, by the way. Right? It's a real question.
No, I appreciate the question. That's a good question to ask. But I actually, to be honest, I don't see that so much. I think he was smart enough not to fall into these traps. That's at the same time, Soviet Union during Stalinist era was doctrinating authors to write in a social realist style, and I don't think he fell into that trap. I don't think he compromised his artistic kind of integrity, and I think he also has influences of impressionist styles in the novel. So I don't see any major blind spots in terms of the class.
It does. It's not social realism in that time sense, and it doesn't become dogmatic, right?
And by the way, I did look into a little bit into Russian novels that came out around the same time. That some of them might have probably influenced Ayalti, and they are much more kind of going through the. We left the kibbutz, and now we're going to the true communist homeland, to the Soviet Union, and that's so they're very indoctrinated.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, kind of to underscore that, and just I thought you were going to read a little bit from the book, but so I have a quote here from page 175. This is conversation with Karim, but who is it? It's Motka.
I think it's 174.
Yeah, 174, right. Motka, for his part, explained to Karim about pogroms and anti-Semitism, Hasidism and Zionism, and why the Jewish workers had come to adopt the conquest of labor. Understand, he said once in conclusion, I'm an anti-Zionist, but I understand the tragic situation of the Jewish people, which has spurred this kind of movement. And you, Karim, as long as you work here, you have to understand it too. So, so that might have been taken as a sense that for their own interests, the Palestinian activists had to understand the situation out of which this Zionism was coming as well. I find that kind of prophetic.
It's prophetic, and I think it comes from the reality of a joint Jewish Arab party, that there's this dialogue between the two. And I agree that with all the criticism that the novel has about policies and practices, and there's kind of rebelliousness at the heart of the novel, rebelliousness against labor Zionism, it still shows a lot of empathy and kindness towards the people in the kibbutzim, the kibbutznik, the labor Zionists. I do believe, and I truly believe they came, I know they did come with the highest ideals to form those kibbutzim, to realize the new society and the new person and the new everything, to build an utopian reality. I believe that that's the case. And then they met the ground, and they had to, and it took on a different path, the dominant route. But yeah, so I believe that that's so. I agree that that's.
I'll throw in here that, I mean, if you haven't read the book, you will, and you'll see if you agree with me, that if you read this book in 1936, I guess especially if you were a reader of the Freiheit already, you might get the impression that the kibbutzim were doomed to collapse entirely, right? Because it's a point where they don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to farm. They don't have any food. They may nominally have some support from the Jewish agency, but they're not getting seeds. They're not, right? It really sounds like sort of a bad Woodstock or something like that. But in a sense, there are moments where this seems like a tragic account, which is remarkable for a communist, right? Communists are not supposed to take a tragic view of history. I'm thinking particularly of the account of riots in 1929, where he refers to the rage of millennia, which is a kind of narrative of primordial hostility between Arabs and Jews, which hardly seems anti-Zionist. And I guess that's sort of continuing the theme of his being able to see many perspectives at once.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I believe, yes, so you're talking about, I think of specifically with the Milner, who's a Jewish anti-Zionist propagator that kind of influences them to leave labor Zionism and join The PKP, by the way, I should mention, was an underground party, but the British deemed it illegal.
Right.
So it was illegal in the British management for 20 years. So they had to work in an underground in this joint Jewish-Arab kind of setting. And that is key because this underground work is also depicted in the novel, by the way. So he goes to this restaurant after the riots and trying to gather money for victims of families. And it's an Arab restaurant, and he's asked which families, and he says the Arabs and the Jews, and he immediately gets beaten up and kind of thrown out because it was a challenging for both sides, for Arabs and Jews, to have a joint Jewish-Arab party was a challenging endeavor for both sides. And I think Ayalti, with a very ironic kind of typical style, shows it through that scene.
Right, but again, also a sense that perhaps there is something to this idea that there are primordial I mean, that again, that phrase "rage of millennia" just really struck me, and I wonder if any of the editors of the Freiheit, this was published in the Freiheit, right? Am I remembering correctly?
I believe the publisher of the book wasn't.
No, in when it was serialized.
Yeah, yes, in two papers. I think one of them, I believe it was Friday. I have it in the
The
slide.
Freiheit, basically the Yiddish pro-Soviet newspaper in New York. Yeah. I think this is my last question.
I think it was Eastern Europe, by the way. It was published.
Oh,
I'm not sure
not in New York.
No,
Okay.
I think it wasn't published in the Freiheit.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. We'll get to it.
It wasn't.
Okay.
Yes, the Freiheit, which is the American Yiddish communist paper, had this whole controversy in 1929 when it kind of switched its views right after the pogroms. It was in favor of the Jews, and then it got dictation from the Soviet Union, and it switched its views a bit. This is an uprising. And by the way, in the novel, they kind of, I think Milner, the same communist character, says, is this an uprising or a pogrom?
Right.
The Aufstand or pogrom? Thank you.
Right.
Roman, how do you characterize what you see here? Yeah, but the novel wasn't published in the Freiheit.
Yeah, my mistake.
That's okay.
My
Yeah.
my mistake. So here's my last question for you, but it's a big one, right? Aside from adding, and I've already alluded to this, what I think is a fairly nuanced class analysis, right? It's a class analysis, but it's not a doctrinaire class analysis. It's a class analysis through describing what was happening and how people were interacting and what their contrasting interests were. And that's, of course, a class analysis which seems lacking from most anti-imperialist rhetoric about Israel and Palestine today. So aside from that nuance, what are some of the lessons of this book for us today?
Well, first I have to say how much I share with you the premise of your question, because I think that is a true contribution of the novel, this nuanced class analysis. And I agree with everything you just said. So that's not a small achievement. That's not a small feat in itself. That's very valuable. And I think some of those other lessons I touched in my presentation earlier, that it's kind of gives evidence of dissident voices in real time that were suppressed. A lot of those underground activists, either they were kicked out by the British or they're imprisoned. Ayalti himself sat in prison in Palestine, or they're also, and some of them remain underground until the Communist Party became legal somewhere, I think 40s, late 40s. And so those suppressed voices, now we show that there's evidence that there existed. And also the fact that this dissident voices came really from within. It's a very intimate dissident voice. It came from the heart of the Yishuv and the kibbutz itself. And it was written in Yiddish. The Jewish language was also written, used in the Yishuv. So this creates this intimacy, I think, that today is lacking as well. And those who can be open to be challenged on some basic assumptions and look towards a shared and peaceful future of both Arabs and Jews in the land. And I'm very proud that the novel received positive reviews from reviewers from all different sides of the political aisle. I had like very good review from the leftist of Jewish currents, like Elisa Solomon, and I had this rabbi from Cincinnati that gave me a very positive review and had a very different takeaway from the novel. But I'm very pleased with all these kinds of perspectives and reviews, and I think that's what's the meaningful about this novel. I'm grateful it satisfies people from different perspectives. And yes, there is a sense of prophetic tragedy in the novel, since we know what happened later on, and we know what's going on today. But I also believe that there's also hope through the showing of dissenting voices in Jewish history, like Smol Emuni is is a dissenting voice in itself. Smol Emuni is a dissenting voice in a traditional modern Orthodox world. That these forces that have dissenting views that have the courage to swim against the current and work towards peace and justice for both peoples.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
So, do you want to take the microphone? We're going to keep
We're-
this tight, but about.
We're going to do some Q&A, and I'm going to start, the room here is fabulous. We're a little rowdy, so I'm going to start with the Zoom questions. We have 2 of them, and then look forward to hearing from the room as well. So 2 questions, I'll ask both of them, and then I'll leave it to you, Jonathan, to call on people in the room, and I will pass the mic around. I'm just going to ask people in the room not to speak without the mic, because we want the Zoom folks to be able to hear everything. So Debbie Nasowski asks the following. Recently, the Bund has been credited with leading the anti-Zionist worker solidarity movement in Israel, as well as elsewhere. Here, it seems that Hashomer Hatzair led demands for solidarity with the Palestinians. Any reflections on their respective roles? That's question 1. Question 2. Roberta Spivak asks, do you see this book as offering a path forward to those working for peace and reconciliation, or does its affiliation with communism limit its use?
Well, I'll start from the second question. Obviously, I think I mentioned it. I do think it's a book that can serve as an opening for reconciliation and I don't want to sweep it under the rug. The communists deserve credit for being the first Jewish Arab party, which is the ideal, which is people trying to make it happen before the election in Israel right now. And this is still the ideal for kind of a more just future, for sure. And they deserve the full credit for being the first ones who were the joint Jewish Arab party. It wasn't, there are other parties that people mention, Brit Shalom. Brit Shalom was just Jews. And there are other ones, and there were liberals, and there are other ones. They were the first Jewish Arab party. They deserve the full credit. So you should not be afraid of the term communist and acknowledge that achievement. The first question was about, well, the Bund, that's funny. The Bund was centered in Eastern Europe, and much of its base was exterminated in World War II. The Shomer HaTzair was Zionist, so it wanted to create create some kind of a utopian reality, but had believed that Jews should do it in the land of Israel. There are some similarities, but the Shomer HaTzair actually leaned towards communism and the Soviet Union, while the Bund kind of had a rift with the Soviet Union. So that's already, the Shomer HaTzair, by the way, was afraid during the McCarthy years that it will also be persecuted in the US as well. The Bund, the Bund was not super active in Israel. I happen to have known the Bundists that did live in Israel. There's a documentary about them, Abundaim, and they had their center in Tel Aviv, and I used to know them, and I wrote articles for their magazine that was in Yiddish that was still going on. So they were progressives, and they they weren't in the forefront. This was different. It was kind of a post-war phenomenon. I know the question came from the fact that there's a very successful book now about the Bund with a very particular agenda. I'm very happy that the Bund is discussed and is part of it, but it's just kind of it's not exactly the same route. But I'm happy to talk about it more.
Yeah, I just if I can add to that, my sense from the question is that the Bund being to a certain degree, to a large degree, at the time and retrospectively, the largest and sort of most articulate progressive alternative to Zionism in East European Jewish politics. Is true, but as you're suggesting, that discourse was centered in Eastern Europe itself rather than in the Yishuv, precisely because the Bundes didn't think that we should all be going to Palestine. Yeah, why don't you take the question?
Two questions. One, what was the, I guess, what was the popular response in the Yishuv to this book and to his work? And two, did he have any relationship with the old Yishuv? And they're historically a little bit more amenable to Palestine, I could say Arab or Muslim Jewish relations.
Thank you for that question. So the first question, how was it received in the Yishuv? There's no concrete evidence of that. It wasn't a bestseller. It came out in Eastern Europe. He wrote it while he was in Paris, and then it came out in an Eastern European publisher. So it wasn't sold in abundance in the Yishuv. So there is no kind of, I looked, and he had, Ayalti had contacts in Israel after the founding. He kept on throughout his life, and I saw his correspondence, and I'm actually working on something, his relation with another author, Yiddish author who wrote about the kibbutz. I'm interested in that, but there's no evidence that he was read. There's not a lot of kind of, at some point, again, as I said in the presentation, he suppressed himself, the novel. He was he had some hard time with knowing this cognitive dissonance, that especially after the 40s and the Holocaust and the establishment, he wanted not to deal with the amount of criticism. About what you said about the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Yeshuv Yashan, there is a very fascinating segments when the radicals work underground. Their center is in Jerusalem, so they work in an underground kind of apartments, and and what they see around them is the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they kind of this odd mix of these Marxist secular revolutionaries and the Hasidic or just the other types of ultra-Orthodox Jews walking in Jerusalem, and those interactions is kind of very interesting. And I actually wrote a piece about that.
Sounds like the Lower East Side in the 1930s.
I'm curious also about what's happening with the novel now. Are there any preparations to translate it either into Hebrew or into Arabic?
That's a very good question. First of all, Hebrew, I'd be thrilled. I probably should do it. I already have one chapter, as I said. I just have to find the time and the right kind of venue, but it's perfect to come out in Hebrew, absolutely, no doubt. And I'd be thrilled if you know of an Arabic translator who wants to translate it from Yiddish to Arabic. It won't be hard, but that's the ideal. If that would be wonderful. So I don't have it yet, but that's something that I would be very, very happy to have. And there was another question.
Are there publishers who've indicated interest in publishing it?
In Arabic? Well, I haven't made attempts yet to do it, but I think in Hebrew that could be published very easily, and have more access also to that world. But Arabic, yeah, I'll try, because I do think it's. Well, ideally they should translate from the original, yes. So it'll be hard to find. That's a good idea, though. Great idea.
So my question might go in a slightly different direction, and Yasha Koyach and all this stuff,
Okay.
which has to do with the PKP. So we have this very interesting moment in Palestine in which people who are Jewish, primarily 99% Ashkenazic, right, are working with Palestinians, and they end up including a famous poet like Emil Habibi, right? And we have also these very interesting tell-all memoirs like Melch Epstein that are discussing communists, Yiddish-speaking communists in the US, like the ones aligned with the Freiheit, and the ones who are busy working in Palestine as equally unrealistic and sort of going by what's called Moscow rules, which is historically it's not correct that everything is dictated by the Comintern, right? But we have also two other examples, which I think can come into play here. Maybe if one takes this holistically, there are three really important Jewish Arab language Palestinian parties at the same time. You have to think about what's happening in Egypt with people like Ayalti and what's happening in Baghdad, right? And so you have an enormous Jewish presence in communist parties, and they're in dialogue. They're not in the same situation for obvious reasons, but they are in dialogue as well as with their communists in America who are speaking Yiddish. So you have this network, this transnational network of people who are communists who are trying to figure out the question of the Middle East. And it's really, really interesting what you see in the 30s. And that, I think, can be further developed in some sense if you do a new edition or solicit comments for future reviews.
Absolutely. I'm gonna adopt your comments and insights. Thank you.
Well, one question is just about the Yiddish original. Is that, where do people get that? And is there any plan to spread that around more as the translation is coming out? And also just about the whole, what do you think, like, as you said, there were idealists at the time who wanted what's best for all, but didn't see things the same way. What was their blind spot? What were they missing when they were looking at the same situation?
Yeah, you said the people who didn't join the likes of Zalman. Okay, you asked two questions about the Yiddish original. Not easy to find the Yiddish original. I found it in very specific locations. I know. Wait a second. So first of all, you're right. There's a scan of it in the Yiddish Book Center. I should acknowledge the Yiddish Book Center, which gave me a kind of a scholarship to explore, and they were very helpful translation scholarships. I should acknowledge them. I mentioned the National Library of Israel, but the book form was scanned by the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, and you can read it in the PDF form. The printed version, that was not, you don't find it anywhere. I found one in Jerusalem in the National Library. I found one at YIVO here in New York. And I found one in the Jewish Public Library of Montreal. I was so happy to find a copy of it there. It's a very dear institution, and they have it there, and I was very moved that they did. And I think, I can add another thing. My father, who comes from, in part from a kind of a Litvish background, Lithuanian Jewish, went on his first tour to Latvia and Lithuania. And in Kovner, in an antique shop, after I gave him a tip from another Yiddish scholar, he found, and I forgot to bring it with me today to show you, it came out in a book, came out in the newspaper, and it came out in notebooks in five, and he found two in an antique shop. It cost him, 25 euros each, and he brought it with, he made the trip, and I have it with me in New York, so there's that. And the second question about why did they not fall along the being renegades, those who stayed and kind of followed with the conquest of labor. That was the question. Well, they were part of a movement. They had, so they went along. Most people go along. That's why I said, you have to go against the current. That's why they're dissident. The majority of Shomer HaTzair, they had their ideals, they had their vision that they brought from Europe, but in practice, they did the leadership with all the went along a lot of times, instead of going on this kind of class solidarity basis, went on and kind of shoved the socialism aside and said, no, we have to build the nation first, and socialism can wait. Which I was so that's the basis of the kind of, I was going to say in Yiddish, being buntaren, being renegades. And so, yeah, most people, they had protection. They were part of a collective. They were part of a society. They had protection. They felt it's not so easy to leave, and rebel against everything you came to realize. So but they did have, as the tradition of a Shomer HaTzair, very, very strong ideological debates all the time and discussion. That's part of the practice of a Shomer HaTzair, these kind of confessions and ideological conversations. And they followed Marx, and they followed Freud, and so that was very, very, very strong within them. But yeah, to actually make the move, that's however, it bothered so many people that there were hundreds of Shomer HaTzair members who left at the time to join, left the Shomer because of these practices, the labor Zionism, because of these practices, and many of them joined the PKP. And at some point, I saw it in the introduction, they became the majority in the PKP, the people from the Shomer HaTzair. So
we promised to start and end on time. I want to thank everybody who's here in the room, everybody who's listening on Zoom, and the book is available. I'm sure, did you put it in right here, but also in the chat, and the conversations are only beginning and certainly to be continued.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
I'm just going to say a few closing remarks. Shkoyach. I'm Rachel Landsberg, and I'm an organizer with Small Emuni. And I want to just also appreciate the wonderful spirited crowd here in the room. Those of you who joined us via Zoom, we really encourage people to buy books, either in person here or online. Adi and Jonathan, want to thank you both for this really meaningful conversation. Both kind of taking us back to a different time and a different world, but also thinking about the impacts today. And I think that's really what we do try to do here at Small Emuni US, is bringing in different voices and different perspectives to really reflect on the moment before us, what we can do as Jews, many of us as observant Jews, kind of in this moment, and really your insights and your perspective, and the book that we will hopefully all read really help fill out that picture. I want to just thank the people behind the scenes, Benjamin, Tzvi, Galia, and Gershon for doing a lot of work behind the scenes. Huge thanks to Jonathan and Alana for hosting us. And finally, I want to just say a word about Small Emuni. Should this be your first time with us, we've been around for a little over a year. We're a place to come for community and connection, a place where people feel love and care for the peoples and the land of Israel, and a place where we can ask questions and grapple with the current moment, raise concerns, talk about what we'd like to see happen moving forward, that we need to do that in community. We need to do that together. We need to not be silent. We need to find the Torah and the Judaism that speaks to us in this moment, Judaism of compassion and justice. So please join us. We have events coming up in July. Stay tuned. We have an online community gathering. I believe it's Thursday, July 16th. to come and learn a little bit with us and be in community and conversation online. We're also going to have something on Tisha B'Av together to mark the Day of Destruction and Mourning. And finally, we're having a trip to Israel, Palestine in October. And if you're interested, please join us tomorrow. Look online for a online informational meeting about that trip, which I think will be very exciting. Thanks again to everyone. Erev Tov. Have a good evening. Thanks so much.
Just one. I've been handed a note to remind me that we are graced to have Hanan Ayalti's son and grandson with us in the room, and we are honored, and we hope that you feel honored as well by this evening.
Hold on.
Amazing was how young he was when all this. I mean, he wrote his first book in Hebrew in Poland while he was finishing gymnasium. He went to a Hebrew gymnasium in Białystok, and this is his second book, and he's 24. I mean, he's not. So he was not. Yeah, he was very ambitious and wanted both to be a writer and change the world. And of course, it turned out very well.
It's easier to be a writer than to change the world.
Thank you for being here with us. Erev Tov, everyone. Have a good night.